Welcome to an hour of HealthMade Radio. HealthMade is a community for natural health seekers where we educate people about common health conditions and share extensive research on the most effective natural health treatments and promote legislation that protects our health freedoms. A core concept belief is in the innate intelligence and healing power of the body, and if properly supported spiritually, emotionally, and nutritionally, it can find its way back to health. HealthMade Radio will bring information from integrative health experts throughout the world. Check us out at healthmade.co. Health is what you make it. I am Dr. Michael Karlfeldt, and I will be your host. Today's guest is Dr. Don Huber. Dr. Huber is probably one of the leading experts in regards to the discussion that we're having today about GMO and the impact that it has on our bodies. Dr. Huber, how long have you been involved in research of GMO and its potential, both the beneficial potential, but now also the negative impact that it has on us?
Well, I was the first one to have permission to genetically field test a genetically engineered organism in Indiana. So it goes back to the mid-'80s, early '90s.
And what put you in that position?
I was looking at various physiological processes in studying soil ecology. We know that there are a number of organisms that can fix atmospheric nitrogen that make it available then for plant uptake. And looking at some of the physiology that's involved there, we recognize that that process from a symbiotic relationship is only working 10 or 12 hours a day. There were some things that we could do to change that so that those organisms would work for us 24 hours a day. But to do that, we had to change some of the physiology, and so we were interested in inserting some genes from another bacterium into one of the bacteria that fixes the nitrogen, and we were able to increase that fixation, that availability of nitrogen, about fourfold for our legume plants. And so it was an interesting process, one that would have potential for us. But then we started also seeing some unintended consequences that were a result of that. And one thing led to another, that as we started to understand what the process was and some of the other things that were going on, it wasn't nearly as exciting a process to answer all of the world's problems that we had envisioned. In fact, genetic engineering was going to solve all the world's problems for the 21st century. We find now, after 25 years of seeing what it's done in a commercial realm, that it's really failed on every point.
And still they are pursuing GMO, even though they see that this is an absolutely failed experiment.
Correct. And that's because of the dollars that are involved. Yeah. It's a very lucrative process if you happen to hit the gold mine and can get it through the regulatory process. You have a patent, you have a monopoly on a system, whether that's a crop or even whether that's just a bacterium or a process with gene editing to reduce severity of a disease, for instance, as it's promoted. Now, the problem with that is that if you don't have any accountability, then you get away with it.
Yeah.
But in our society, we used to think that there was accountability, and we used to also honor the precautionary principle, so that when you were doing research and you had a red flag that would go up and say, hey, we really need to study this a lot more than we have. There are some things that aren't quite like we anticipated. And then you would back off and you'd do those other experiments so that you could put it in a safety perspective. with genetic engineering, all of that's been thrown out the window for all practical purposes.
Yeah, because the medical model, I mean, you assume that it's still based upon the philosophy first do no harm. And any kind of genetic or bioengineering, genetic manipulation, you are in essence creating a drug because it's something that does not naturally exist in nature. So when you do that, you would think that they would still come from the concept first do no harm. But, with all the money involved, that's not the case.
That's right. And our regulatory agencies that should be overseeing this have been compromised so that we have a tremendous betrayal of the public trust.
And the regulatory agency, we're talking about FDA would be one of them, or is that the main one?
FDA for human, for environmental, you have the EPA, and then for agriculture, you have the USDA. So there are actually three organizations that should be overseeing the genetic engineering and especially looking for unintended consequences.
And how much funding, how much effort are they putting into this?
Essentially none now, and that's because the system's been compromised. The lawsuit, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma lawsuit in California, is uncovering a lot of that fraud and deceit and deception that's gone on, the kind of revolving door, as they call it, from EPA and FDA to back to the companies and back and forth in that process. I think if you read Dr. Miriam Copley's deathbed letter to her supervisor before she died of cancer in 2013, she wrote this letter to the head of the EPA pesticide division, outlining the 16 known mechanisms for carcinogenicity. Those 16 physiological mechanisms that initiate cancer, and she said glyphosate, Roundup, triggers every one of them. Said it has to be a carcinogen. And you had other EPA scientists say, well, why isn't our company, our organization, interested in the carcinogenicity of this product? And you could put that product for a number of other pesticides also, but and then you get the internal memos from the company, and they're justifying huge sums of payment for academic people, well-known toxicologists or people, to put their name on studies that were never conducted. They were generated apparently just sitting around a table with a pencil and a piece of paper and feeling that was perfectly all right.
So here we are then relying on what we feel are scientific studies that we believe are conducted and by leading researchers, and because of their name, their clout, we then start to then develop science based upon this research that you're saying, in essence, just something that the company came up with, sitting around a table and just paying the scientist a huge amount of money to put their name on it.
Correct. And it got so bad in 1988 and 1991 that the EPA just couldn't overlook it. It was the fraud was so intense that they finally took two of the companies that were doing the studies for Monsanto to court. They got 20 felony convictions with some free room and board provided in that for, I think, 5 or 6 people, directors there. But EPA or the court fined them $19.2 million, which to me sounds like a lot of money. But when you're talking about just a royalty alone of $8 billion, that's not even a slap on the hand.
Yeah, most people would be more than willing to pay $19 million if they keep getting $8 billion.
That's correct. The decimal points have a big impact there.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's all about zeros.
So we've had literally a betrayal of the public trust, an abandonment of the precautionary principle that has worked very well for us for 150 years. And what we see now is probably that basis for the fourth volume of Dr. David Gee at the World Health Organization. He's written 3 volumes that are titled Late Lessons Learned from Early Warnings, where he goes through history from World War II of various pharmaceutical products that there was plenty of evidence that we needed more research before commercializing this product, and yet we ignored those, and then we had those late lessons that we had to learn. I think the GMO glyphosate is going to be volume 4, and that he's had the thalidomide, the phenoxys, and a number of other case histories that he's been able to document in those previous volumes, and he's got a tremendous amount of information now for this next one. Steve Drucker, a New York attorney, has written a very excellent documentary on just the safety aspects of the genetic engineering process in his book, Altered Genes, Twisted Truth. Very well documented. He was challenged on it and said, if anyone can find anything that isn't documented in this book that isn't true, he'll be more than happy to change it. And no one's been able to come up with anything in that process. So we are seeing other people that are documenting. We see books like Whitewash by Carrie Gillum on glyphosate and the fraudulent safety studies and those things that have gone on. You have books by Dr. Michelle Perro, very excellent book on what's making our children sick. Again, tying that GMO glyphosate in with the chemistry and biochemistry that's involved with the sickness that is degrading the health of Americans so intensely, and especially our children. So that Tony Mitra, Canada, has his book out on poison foods of North America. Says Canada has the most poisonous foods and America's a close second, documenting how much glyphosate is actually in our food, how much glufosinate, and how much of the toxins as a result of our genetic engineering for the production of those in the plants. So we are seeing independent studies now that are finally starting to come out. There are other studies that should be released. Those have all been censored or suppressed by threats of lawsuit or actual lawsuits that have prevented the scientists from publishing their data. A number of scientists have lost their jobs for publishing data. I know one in agriculture published his data to benefit the farmers to show them that there was less nutrient density in the GMO food and that they needed to increase the manganese and some of the other nutrients in order just to maintain a comparable yield potential. 2 months later, he had to write an apology for publishing his scientific study. And he said, I didn't understand the unintended consequences of
writing the study.
Publishing my science. And,
when we'll be back in just a moment, I'm here chatting with Dr. Don Huber, and we're talking about GMO and how widespread it is and the impact it has both on us health-wise and also financially. We'll be right back. Welcome back to HealthMade Radio. I am Dr. Michael Karlfeldt, and I'm here talking with Dr. Don Huber about GMO. And this is segment number 2. We had segment number 1 a week prior about GMO. I really suggest that you listen to that one as well. So in regards to GMO, Dr. Huber, you're talking about some of the scientific investigations that are now coming out. You mentioned that a number of them been silenced just because there was so much financial pressure on the researcher that conducted the study. But there have been a few of them that has been able to surface. Can you tell me a little bit more about those?
Yes, you have two studies with GMOs specifically that are independent studies. One was with pigs. It's a 5-month study from weaning until market, showing that the pigs that were fed the GMO corn or soybean had all of the symptoms of inflammatory bowel type diseases, the inflammation, the ulceration, leaky gut, deterioration of the intestinal lining. And then you have the 2-year study by Dr. Giles Eric Cirolini's group at University of Caen in France, using the Wistar rats, standard for toxicological type studies, showing that not only did essentially you see the carcinogenicity and liver toxicity and kidney toxicity, but you also saw many other effects, and all of these effects came on very early. 70% of the animals developed malignant lymphomas. You had in his control, he only had one animal that developed malignant lymphoma or breast cancer in that case. And then, so that study was redacted by the paper or by the journal initially when they put a person from Monsanto on their editorial board after the paper had been published for 16 months. Then he was able to exert enough influence that they removed the paper, redacted it. It was then republished in another very excellent, very sound scientific journal. And the journal that had initially redacted that paper has suffered a lot of consequences because it's the first time in history that we've had scientific censorship. There was nothing wrong with the paper. It was probably the most intensely reviewed before publication the first time, and certainly upheld in a second very thorough review for publication. But those two papers alone would say that we need extreme precaution before we move forward with any of these processes.
And here we're just letting, obviously, GMO foods be available and promoted on a large scale when these kind of studies show the opposite.
Correct.
And regards also, I remember that there were some issues in regards to sterility as well, or ability to reproduce. Can you tell me a little bit about that in regards to GMO?
Infertility, Arwina Yermakova in Russia, and her research showed that by the 3rd generation, there was no capability of the rats to reproduce. It's a very strong endocrine hormone disruptor, so that at any level, even a 1/10 of a part per trillion, it has damage to the reproductive hormone system. The overall system is severely damaged there. We have 2 veterinarians that surveyed North America, from Mexico all the way to Canada, surveying the dairies, and their title of their paper was, "Why are so many cows losing pregnancies?" They were losing 25 to 50% of their pregnancies, but that was on top of having 30 to 50% that could never conceive to start with. And so you see it in the animals, you see it in people. In the last 5 years, we've had a 30% drop in fertility in the United States. Well, that means that with the birth rate of 1.75, that we're an endangered species. We qualify to be on that endangered species list. And with that dropping precipitously now, it's a very serious concern. You also look at the birth defects, the malformations that are very prominent both from the glyphosate as well as from the GMO products. And you see that a high percentage of our abortions now are because of malformations of the fetus. In England, that's been about a 15-fold increase in the last 20 years.
Of abortions.
Of the malformation of the children. In Australia, they showed a 450% increase in birth defects, serious birth defects, in any town that was surrounded by Roundup Ready soybeans and the aerial spraying of the glyphosate. So that it's essentially touches every aspect of life, from the environment to our own bodies and our own ability to reproduce there.
So is there a way to avoid glyphosates 100%?
I don't know how we can avoid it 100% in the United States or Canada. It's so ubiquitous because it's used in the Forest Service, it's used on highways and parks and recreation, and half of it is actually used for that, 250,000 pounds a year for non-agriculture and about 250,000 pounds in agriculture. So that it's very difficult to avoid, but we can certainly minimize that impact. Organic food is probably the best single thing that we can do. The problem with organic is that you do have some contamination from drift, but you also have it in water, so that a lot of our waters are contaminated. And EPA has said that you can have up to 700 parts per million in water and it's still safe, when the science shows us that 1/10 of a part per million will disrupt the androgenase hormone system of a developing fetus, or 1/2 a part per million, the estrogenic, the female development hormone. So you see all of those levels are 1 part per million, 2 part per million for different cancers. And but we can certainly go a long way in reducing the impact of that. But organic is one of the best first steps that a person should take. There are some processes or some materials that we can use then also to remove glyphosate from the body. We're told that it just flushed right through us in the urine and we didn't have to worry about it.
So it actually then bioaccumulates in the body.
It does bioaccumulate in the brain and the bones, the bone marrow, and in all of our organs.
Wonderful. We'll be back with Dr. Don Huber. We are going to explore how we can solve this issue and what steps that we can take in order to be able to protect us from, I would call, extinction plague called GMO. Welcome back to HealthMade Radio. I'm here with Dr. Don Huber. We're discussing GMO and its impact on our health and what we can do in order to be able to solve this crisis that we are faced with, the impact of GMO on our bodies and also on our ability to conceive and continue as a species. So Dr. Don Huber, you were starting to mention that this the glyphosate, we were thinking that whatever we take, get from our food, that it just flushes right out, but it actually has an accumulative effect, so it just builds up more and more in our bodies.
Correct. It bioaccumulates in the brain and the bones, bone marrow, all of our organs, the heart, the liver, the spleen, pancreas, kidneys, all of our organs. The muscle tissue is also a bioaccumulative site for glyphosate, so that we just can't avoid it. It's going to be there.
So we really, we're part of this experiment whether we want to or not here, and especially here in the United States where GMO is so prevalent and the laws are in so much favor for GMO food.
Correct. There are some things that we can do. Dr. Karlfeldt, you're an important part of that, education-wise, as well as the assistance and service that you provide to your patients. But there are a number of things that we can do. Certainly, organic food, I mentioned, is one of the things that reduces that level of intake dramatically. There are some products that can be used. Dr. Monica Kruger in Germany at Leipzig University, veterinary pathologist, another veterinary pathologist and medical microbiologist in Australia, Dana Stanley, has shown that humic acids and fulvic acid, clinoptilolite, be another product that have the capability of removing glyphosate from the body. So that a few years ago we were kind of saying, well, you just have to outlive it, and that's kind of hard to do when it keeps accumulating, but there are some materials now that will remove it. All of those materials are chelators, so that you also need to make sure that you're taking a well-balanced mineral supplement if you're going to use any of those materials. But they are capable of restoring fertility. We've seen that in a number of trials, a number of situations by removing the glyphosate. It takes 5 to 6 months in humans. It takes sometimes anywhere from 8 to 24 months in cattle, but you can restore fertility, both of the male and the female, in that process, depending on what the mechanism that's impaired is there. But we've seen that in people that have been infertile for 14 or 15 years of marriage, not able to have a family. And when they've gotten on that program, they have that process is activated and they're able to have that blessing. So
this would be probably the number one thing. Obviously, the first step is always avoidance, which is what you mentioned, trying to do organic as much as you possibly can to reduce the intake of glyphosate, but then to add then these substances in order to be able to remove what is in your system so that you can then reduce your risk for all these 32 diseases that are then connected to GMO foods, such as neurological conditions and cancer, diabetes, obesity, inflammatory bowel diseases, etc.
Right. You'll see 16 of those 32 diseases. The almost complete cure is a fecal transplant. Now, it doesn't sound very appetizing.
And can that be from anyone, or do you have to, from my understanding, you really have to screen the individual that you get the fecal transplant from?
That is very critical, because you have the negatives, the bipolar, the depression, and those things that also originate in the gut. And when you're changing that gut microbiome, you have to be very careful. And so it's a very delicate procedure or process. The procedure isn't very delicate, but the process in selection is very critical for that.
And I would assume with more exposure of chemicals and pathogens, and we were mentioning the earlier episode about that the GMO promotes all these virulent pathogens in the intestinal tract and then kill off the the beneficial bacteria. So we will then have less and less people that will have a healthy biome that will be good candidates to provide fecal transplants.
Right. In Europe, they've been doing it fairly extensively for about 10 years. So they actually have fecal banks, kind of like we have blood banks. But the FDA has considered it a research procedure over here because 5% of the time it's a negative. And that goes back to that donor. If you have a family member that is a compatible donor, very healthy, doesn't have any parasites or any of those problems, that would be the first choice that you would look at it. Now, Dr. Dana Stanley, medical microbiologist at Central Queensland University in Australia, has spent her career dissecting that microbiome, gut microbiome that has been 90% all unknowns for us in the past. With some of our modern techniques, she can identify those organisms. And her approach here the last 5 or 6 years is a very specific microbial probiotic type approach using the colonoscopy again, because we haven't been very successful in oral probiotics, getting them into the GI tract. She has had 100% success for curing type 1 diabetes with specific organisms.
And that is then implanting it then rectally versus taking it orally.
Right.
Yeah.
And she conditions the environment so that it will receive those new organisms. She's done the same thing for autism and with different organisms, but she's gone through all of the animal studies first and then had permission to do the human studies, and tremendous, almost miracle for those people. She's now in the process with the inflammatory bowel diseases of identifying that functional relationship as well as the taxonomic, so that you don't have this mass infusion type of thing that gets you into trouble. And that's the approach that I would prefer. It's just that we don't have all the knowledge that we need in that process, and it's difficult to obtain it. But truly miraculous when you see the change that it brings in a person's life. Now, they have to be willing to change their diet. If they're going to continue to consume this high level of antibiotic that takes those organisms out, it's not going to last very long.
And when we say antibiotic, it's not just antibiotic that we think of when we have a bladder infection or we have a respiratory infection and we take antibiotic. It's actually the GMO itself that is an antibiotic, the glyphosate that functions as an antibiotic in your gut. That's
correct. It's actually even patented as an antibiotic, and you look at that patent, and there are very few taxa or groups of organisms that it isn't toxic to. The problem is that the pathogens are all very tolerant, so it takes 4,000 to 40,000 times more to take out Clostridium, for instance, than it does to take out your beneficials that would control Clostridium.
So with when you're talking about that the individual would need to change their diet so that they don't get all that antibiotic in, that would then obviously include eating organic, staying away from GMO type of food, and also eating, if you eat meat, then staying away from animal products that have consumed GMO, because all of this glyphosate, it accumulates in their tissue as well. So when we eat their tissue, then we introduce those antibiotics into our system.
That's right. That's why the organic needs to go across the board.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how quickly that changes. Zen Honeycutt, in her book that just came out last week, Unstoppable, had 3 boys that were severe autistic. And within 3 weeks, all of them of changing the diet,
That is
all
fascinating.
of them had started to respond very, very nicely, and now none of them show any symptoms of autism.
So it just proves the point that how something that you don't think would have such an impact here in United States, we're just used to pretty much stuffing our mouth with whatever we think tastes good and looks good, but not recognizing that whatever we put into our body, whatever passes our lips, it's actually either poison or medicine.
Correct. I work with a number of veterinarians, and they'll tell you within 3 or 4 days after getting the animals off the GMO and the high glyphosate, because we use a lot of glyphosate for desiccation of the crops, and it accumulates in the grain and in the straw. As soon as they get the animals off of that, their death losses stop, and the behavior improves. Pigs will no longer go around biting tails and chewing on ears and being aggressive. I had one veterinarian that said he had one farm that he hated to even go to anymore because if you had to go out and service a bull, check a bull that was struggling, and he said they were so aggressive that they'd just charge you. And he said some of those bulls had worked with before and were very, very passive before, and the entire behavior changes because of the damage that the glyphosate does to the physiology.
And as soon as they stopped feeding these animals GMO foods, these behaviors resolved.
Yeah, 3 to 4 days within a week.
That's amazing.
Death losses stop and behavior changes.
That's amazing. We'll be back in just a little bit with Dr. Don Huber, where we're talking about GMO and what we can do to resolve this crisis. Welcome back to HealthMade Radio. I'm here with Dr. Don Huber. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. We are discussing the crisis of GMO and what we can do as individuals to help to solve this crisis and to reverse the trend that we're seeing. So, Dr. Don Huber, you just, from people then cutting out GMO foods, there's been change in autistic behavior, been change in health conditions, but also we're looking at then the bioaccumulation. So we have each generation, you have it accumulating then in the mother, and I would assume that when they are pregnant with a child, that some of that will then pass through the placenta to the babies. Is that correct?
Yes, glyphosate goes right across the placental barrier. There's no barrier for it. It's a very small molecule, highly systemic in the body, moves in the bloodstream, and so that there just aren't any barriers. Goes across the blood-brain barrier. So we're essentially a victim or susceptible to all of the effects and its full ramification. So, when you just look at its effect as a very powerful broad-spectrum mineral chelator to immobilize those critical minerals. One veterinarian has been doing liver biopsies and he has Iowa State University that does the mineral analysis. And he says he has entire herds that are having high health problems. And he said when they do the necropsy, there's almost zero manganese and zero cobalt
So these
in the livers.
So the glyphosate, they literally been sucking out these life-giving minerals that we need in order to be able to function properly.
Correct. We're extremely deficient in most of those minerals. If we're on any kind of quote-unquote normal American diet.
So in essence, in order to be able to solve this crisis, we, like you mentioned, we need organic food. We need stay away from any kind of GMO. We also need to add fulvic acid and humic acid in order to be able to move some of these glyphosates out. And in essence, if an individual is even thinking about conceiving, they should start this program immediately so that they will not then expose their child, their future child, to all these chemicals that will then suck out the nutrients out of the fetus, in addition to then creating all these other cancer-causing, diabetes-causing, neurological behavior issues that the glyphosates are connected with.
Correct.
So what we need to do then is, in order to be able to move forward, I mean, what can we do legislatively? What can we do as a nation in order to be able to change what we're now being exposed to?
Two of us kind of stormed the Capitol here in February. We had two proposals. One was an immediate ban on desiccation use of glyphosate. In other words, applying it just prior to harvest. That's when we get the high concentrations of glyphosate in many of our food products. It's systemic in the plant so that it's taken up very readily, even at that late stage in growth. But the only place that it accumulates is in the seed. That's the only chemical sink that's left. Everything else has started to shut down. We wanted an immediate ban on glyphosate for desiccation uses, and then a 3 to 5 year phase-out period for it for all other purposes. That would give growers and others an opportunity to look at the alternatives, and there are very excellent alternatives. They're not always as cheap as glyphosate has become, but there are alternatives for weed control. We used a lot of those 30 years ago, 50 years ago, and we can use them again. There are also some new products that are coming on that are very effective, that much safer and much better to use, much less danger with those materials. So, but to make any changes, you really have to have some labeling. You need to know what's in your food.
And currently, that is not required here in the United States.
Right. The USDA, Congress commissioned the USDA to do that back in 2015. They sampled 300 samples of soybeans and then quit. Now, with the Canadian Food Inspection Authority, they've been sampling foods now for 7 or 8 years, and they have 250,000 food samples that are all listed. And Tony Mitra, in his book, Poison Foods of North America, has been able to organize that 250,000 analytic analyses by crop and by point of origin, so that we have some idea of what foods have the highest level of glyphosate, so you can at least start getting down to those that are below the detection level.
So if we don't do anything, if we don't take action, I mean, since Monsanto and now with the merger with Bayer, they control pretty much what gives life, which is seeds. And obviously that it becomes a monopoly. So they can dictate not only the price of the seed, but they can also dictate what it will grow, what kind of nutrients that's in it. So if we don't make a change now, will we then reach a point where there's pretty much no return?
If we haven't reached that already, I don't think we've reached it yet, but certainly there's a tremendous amount of human suffering going on now that doesn't need to be. And I think we're seeing that pendulum swing. We're seeing a 16% increase in organic. We're seeing the demand getting large enough for it now that the prices are dropping because the supply is increasing. And you're seeing it become much more accessible for the general population rather than just little niche markets that it used to be 5 or 6 years ago. So we're seeing the supply there, but you still need to shop with your pocketbook or express your views with your pocketbook, and the market will respond.
And that's key as a consumer to be able to. I mean, you control the products with what you're buying. So the more organic you buy, the more aware you are, and also the more you push for labeling. You have products that put label GMO free, to purchase those so that it will then trigger other companies to do the same.
Correct. And I know when China said we want 30% more non-GMO, they went to Brazil. They didn't come to the United States. They were convinced that the United States wasn't going to change.
We're just so far gone.
Went to Brazil, and the Brazilian farmer said, we'd love to have that market, and immediately started moving to organic.
So that is what we need to do as consumers, is that we need to push the companies to do the right thing. Dr. Don Huber, I'm so grateful for all the insight and all the information that you've given us today. You're truly a wealth of information in this area. And it is such a crucial fight for us to fight against the trend of GMO and the impact that it has on us health-wise. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. This is HealthMade Radio. Please check us out at healthmade.co. Thank you so much for listening in today.